This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com in review, and what I'm looking at today is 1982's Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, directed by Tommy Lee Wallace. Halloween 3, Season of the Witch is perhaps the truest interpretation of what John Carpenter planned for the Halloween franchise, which is to say movies happening around the holiday of Halloween, but not involving Michael Myers. Each story existing independently of that character, and that character perhaps not even appearing again. And it's also a movie that gets a lot of bad press for the wrong reasons. For instance, it's often considered to be a financial failure. And this confuses me because, as far as I can see, it wasn't. Now, that being said, it wasn't successful as Carpenter's original, which cost somewhere in the ballpark of $325,000 and earned over $70 million, an insane rate of return, and that the producers apparently expected that to be able to happen again is kind of telling, and to be honest, also kind of unlikely. Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, in 1982 cost just over $2 million. And while that is significantly more than the original movie, it's not a lot of money, especially now. I imagine some big films spend $3 million on food for the actors, and I'm not kidding about that, by the way. So $3 million in 1982 is significantly more money than it currently is. That being said, it's still not a lot of money, especially when you take into account the original movie made $70 million. Now, Halloween 3 Season of the Witch earned just over $14 million. Still a pretty decent rate of return. Not as spectacular as the original movie, to be sure, but it did not flop. Yet, every time I look into this movie, it seems to indicate that it didn't do well. I'm not seeing that. It's not great. It's certainly not comparable to the first movie, but it's hardly a failure. Though, as I said, with this movie, Tommy Lee Wallace, who wrote it with John Carpenter and I believe one other writer, both of whom were uncredited, moved beyond what was introduced in Halloween and bring us something that I think is really interesting. It revolves around a doctor who is played by Tom Atkins, who's one of John Carpenter's favorite actors. He turns up in quite a few of his movies. And one day this man comes into the hospital. No one knew who he is, no one knows what he's going on about, but a well-dressed person kills this man, escapes to their car, and the car blows up. Eventually, the man's daughter turns up, so she and Tom Atkins' character retrace his steps to try to figure out why it is that someone would kill him. This eventually leads them to this town, a corporate town, that exists entirely due to the Silver Shamrock Company, which is owned by Connell Cochran, played by Dan O'Herlihy. And he is a great actor. He reminds me somewhat of Angus Scrimm in terms of his presence. In any case, never mind the suit. In any case, he's up to something with one of the products he makes, which is a Halloween mask. And what Tom Atkins and the lady have to do is to investigate what Cochran is doing and how this resulted in her father's death. This is genuinely a clever movie, though it's odd in that despite having cinematography by Dean Cundey, who's worked on most of John Carpenter's movie, Halloween 3 does not look very cinematic. In fact, it looks like a television movie. That doesn't help. And part of the problem, I think, is that Tommy Lee Wallace, despite being the main writer of this story, doesn't commit to his premise enough. This movie needed to be, dare I say, more violent. It's a great idea. I think it's awesome. But it's very stingy with the gore, and it needed to put that more up front. And you'll notice that I haven't really given you many details about what happens in the movie, because you may not have seen Halloween 3 Season of the Witch yourself. And it's certainly worth seeing. It's pretty enjoyable, great music by John Carpenter and Alan Howarth, but you can see the movie is really trying to do something, but it just doesn't commit to it. This movie needs a remake. This is an interesting movie. It's a fun movie, and it's clever. Though I should mention one thing. It's not necessarily a spoiler, but the scale of Cochran's plans are too local. If this movie were remade, and I hope it is because it needs it, Cochran needs to be working on a larger scale. It needs to be much grander. Instead of being essentially a US thing, it needs to be a world thing. Another thing is that it needs to be clarified how Cochran is creating automatons. This can be done by magic, but in the movie it's not. It's just engineering, and I don't buy that. They're too lifelike. They're very stiff, mind you, but still lifelike. Too lifelike to be just something you can disassemble somewhere. The story has a plot element that would have answered that question, namely, Cochran steals one of the Stonehenge stones. This could have been used to power the automatons. Now keep in mind, in this story, Stonehenge has all types of mystical abilities, which some people actually believed, I suspect. And pieces of it were used to power the Silver Shamrock Mask. Suppose Cochran took it, the stone from Stonehenge, not only to power the mask, but to animate his automatons. I think that would have been a really neat twist, and it would explain away the idea that this is supposed to be just a clockwork person. It doesn't work very well. Another thing, though, that I think is particularly interesting and well done about this movie is that with too many movies, the evil person has a long, convoluted reason for doing whatever it is that they do. This tendency is understandable because you have to justify their actions somehow. But at the same time, what Cochran did, he did for the joy of the game. And that's awesome. It wasn't a particularly deep reason from outside looking in. But from his perspective, it makes total sense. And I like that Cochran wasn't trying to justify what he was doing. He thought it was a great joke, and he wanted to play it on everyone. The idea of bringing Halloween back to its roots, I think, is a really clever premise, because what it has degenerated to is children begging for candy, though Cochran wants to take it to a time where it meant something, where in the night ghosts and all sorts of creatures resided. And that's interesting. And sure, if he has to kill a few people to bring that about, maybe that's a goal worth thinking about. But what do you think? This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. If you agree, disagree, let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow.